Mountain Man said, "I'm too old for marriage," until the obese girl said, "You are the rest of my life." The February wind cut through the modest dress like 1,000 tiny blades as Elara stumbled through the muddy main street of Redemption Creek. Her father's words still rang in her ears, sharp and final as a judge's gavel. The townsfolk had gathered near the general store, their whispers forming a chorus of judgment that followed her every labored step. She clutched her worn carpetbag tighter, the only possession she'd been allowed to take when her father declared he could no longer afford to feed a daughter who ate like 3 men but worked like half a woman. The blacksmith's wife turned away with a deliberately loud sniff. The banker's daughter giggled behind her gloved hand. Even Reverend Cotton, who preached charity every Sunday, suddenly found great interest in adjusting his pocket watch, rather than meeting her desperate eyes. Elara's chest tightened, not from exertion, but from the crushing weight of shame. At 18 years old, she stood alone in a town that had known her since birth, yet now regarded her as little more than an inconvenience to be rid of. The mud squelched beneath her boots as she made her way toward the edge of town, unsure of where she would go or how she would survive. The spring thaw had turned the roads into rivers of brown slush, and the gray sky promised more rain before nightfall. Behind her, she heard her father's voice raised in the tavern, likely already spending the money he'd saved by casting her out. The laughter that followed his words burned hotter than any physical wound. She had almost reached the last building when a shadow fell across her path. Elara looked up through tear-blurred vision to see Silas Thorne standing in the middle of the street, his broad shoulders blocking out the weak afternoon sun. The mountain man was a legend in these parts, a solitary figure who came to town only for supplies, speaking little and trusting fewer. His weathered face bore the marks of a hard life, and his eyes held depths that most folks found unsettling. He stood there now, utterly still, his gaze fixed not on her but on the crowd that had gathered to witness her humiliation. When Silas finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of granite mountains. "This girl comes with me." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs as every eye in Redemption Creek turned to stare at the impossible scene before them. The untouchable mountain man, claiming the town's cast-off daughter. Her father emerged from the tavern, face flushed with drink and anger, but one look at Silas's expression stopped his protest in his throat. There was something final in the way Silas stood, something that spoke of decisions made and consequences accepted. He turned to Elara then, and for the first time she saw not pity in his eyes, but something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of understanding between two souls who knew what it meant to be unwanted. Without another word, Silas gestured toward the wagon waiting at the edge of town, and Elara found her feet moving forward, carrying her toward an uncertain future that suddenly felt less frightening than the certain despair she was leaving behind. The wagon lurched forward, leaving Redemption Creek and its cruel judgment in the dust. Silas sat beside her on the rough wooden seat, his massive hand steady on the reins as the horses pulled them toward the distant mountains. Elara dared a glance at her unexpected savior, taking in the strong line of his jaw, the silver threading through his dark hair, and the way his shoulders seemed to carry more than just physical strength. He had to be at least 15 years her senior, maybe more, with hands that bore the calluses of endless labor and scars that spoke of violent encounters. His buckskin jacket was worn but well maintained, and his boots showed the careful repair work of a man who valued what he owned. Why? The word escaped her lips before she could stop it, small and uncertain in the vast openness of the prairie. Silas didn't look at her immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon where the mountains rose like sentinels against the darkening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and deliberate, each word chosen with care. No one deserves to be thrown away like trash, especially not in front of the whole damn town for their entertainment. He paused, the muscle in his jaw tightening. I know what it's like to be judged for things you can't control. The statement hung between them, heavy with unspoken history. Elara wanted to ask more, to understand what had driven this solitary man to intercede on her behalf, but something in his posture warned against pressing too hard too soon. Instead, she focused on the landscape rolling past them. The prairie stretched endlessly, broken only by occasional stands of cottonwood and the silver ribbon of a distant creek. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the air grew cooler and carried the sharp scent of pine. There are rules if you're coming to my place, Silas said after another long silence. You'll have your own space, your own privacy. I expect help with the work, there's plenty of it, but I won't tolerate disrespect or laziness. I also won't tolerate anyone hurting you, including me. You understand? His eyes finally met hers, and she saw both warning and promise in their depths. You're free to leave whenever you want. I'll take you to the next town, give you enough money to start over proper. But while you're under my roof, you're under my protection. The formality of his words should have felt cold, but instead they offered something Elara hadn't experienced in years. Dignity. He wasn't offering charity born of pity, but a partnership built on mutual respect and clear boundaries. She nodded, unable to trust her voice past the lump in her throat. Silas gave a single sharp nod in return and guided the horses off the main trail onto a narrower path that wound deeper into the wilderness. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Silas pulled the wagon to a stop near a clearing beside a burbling stream. We'll camp here tonight, he announced, climbing down with practiced ease. It's another half-day's ride to the ranch, and these mountains aren't kind to travelers after dark. He moved with efficient purpose, unhitching the horses and leading them to water, while Elara sat frozen on the wagon seat, suddenly aware of how completely her life had changed in the span of a few hours. You planning to sit there all night, or are you going to help me gather firewood? Silas's question carried no mockery, only practical expectation. Elara climbed down carefully, her legs stiff from the long ride, and began collecting fallen branches from the edge of the clearing. By the time the first stars appeared, Silas had a fire crackling and a simple meal of beans and salt pork warming in a cast-iron pot. He worked in comfortable silence, his movements economical and sure, the actions of a man long accustomed to caring for himself in harsh conditions. When the food was ready, he handed her a tin plate and spoon without ceremony. Eat, he said, settling himself on a log across the fire from her. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. As Elara took her first bite, she noticed Silas had given her a portion equal to his own. Not more, not less. Just equal. The simple gesture broke something inside her that had been holding firm all day, and tears began to slide silently down her cheeks. She tried to hide them, turning her face away from the firelight, but Silas's quiet voice reached across the darkness. "Crying's nothing to be ashamed of. Better to let it out than let it poison you from the inside." After they finished eating, Silas disappeared into the darkness and returned with an armful of canvas and rope. Within minutes, he'd erected a small but sturdy shelter on the far side of the clearing, separate from where he'd laid out his own bedroll near the fire. "That's yours for the night," he said, gesturing to the tent. "I'll keep the fire going and watch for predators. You sleep." He handed her a thick wool blanket that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. "Morning comes early out here." Ilara crawled into the tent, exhausted beyond measure, but feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Safe. As she drifted toward sleep, she could hear Silas moving quietly around the camp, checking the horses, banking the fire, settling into his watch. The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was the sound of him humming, a low, wordless melody that spoke of loneliness and endurance, of mountains that stood firm against the endless march of time. The ranch appeared as they crested the final ridge, and Ilara caught her breath at the sight. Nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pines and granite peaks, the cabin stood solid and weathered, built from massive logs that spoke of both permanence and isolation. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and nearby she could see a barn, a chicken coop, and what looked like a vegetable garden waiting for spring planting. A creek ran along the northern edge of the property, its water clear and cold from the mountain snowmelt. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a world entire unto itself, far from the judgment and cruelty of towns like Redemption Creek. Silas guided the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin and climbed down, his movements betraying a weariness that Ilara suspected came from more than just the journey. "Home," he said simply, the single word carrying layers of meaning she was only beginning to understand. He helped her down from the wagon with surprising gentleness for such large hands, then began unhitching the horses. "Barn's that way if you want to help me get them settled. Then I'll show you the rest." The barn was as well maintained as everything else on the property, with sturdy stalls and a loft full of sweet-smelling hay. 2 horses already occupied stalls, their ears pricking forward with interest at the new arrivals. Ilara helped Silas brush down the team and distribute feed, falling into a rhythm that felt natural despite her inexperience. He corrected her grip on the brush without condescension, showed her how to check the horse's hooves for stones, and explained the feeding schedule with patient detail. "You learn quick," Silas observed as they finished up. "That'll serve you well here. Ranch life doesn't forgive ignorance or laziness, but it rewards honest effort." He latched the barn door and led her toward the cabin. Inside, the space was larger than it appeared from outside, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, a smaller bedroom visible through an open doorway, and a ladder leading to a loft above. Everything was scrupulously clean and organized, the mark of a man who lived alone by choice and had learned to care for his own needs without complaint. "Loft's yours," Silas said, gesturing upward. "I've got my room down here. There's a washroom out back with a copper tub. Water comes from the creek through a pipe I rigged up. Takes time to heat, but it works. Outhouse is 30 yards east, behind those aspens." He moved to the stone fireplace and began building up the fire from the banked coals. Chickens need tending morning and evening. Garden'll need planting soon. There's mending, cooking, preserving, soap making, and 100 other tasks that keep a place like this running. I'll teach you what you don't know. Elara climbed the ladder to inspect her new quarters and found a space that, while simple, had clearly been prepared for her arrival. A straw mattress lay on a sturdy wooden frame, covered with quilts that showed careful stitching. A small table held a basin and pitcher, and pegs on the wall offered places to hang clothes. A window looked out over the valley, offering a view that took her breath away. Silas had known he was bringing her here. He had prepared for her arrival. The realization sent a warm flush through her chest. The days that followed fell into a pattern that was both exhausting and strangely satisfying. Elara rose before dawn to help Silas with the morning chores, learning to milk the 2 dairy goats he kept, gather eggs from the chickens, and prepare a substantial breakfast to fuel the day's labor. Silas was a patient teacher, demonstrating tasks with methodical care and allowing her to make mistakes without harsh judgment. When she accidentally spooked the goats and sent them bleating across the barnyard, he simply helped her round them up and showed her how to approach them more calmly. When she burned the first batch of biscuits she attempted, he ate them anyway and suggested adjustments for the next try. Working alongside Silas, Elara began to notice things about him that contradicted his reputation as a hardened recluse. He spoke gently to the animals, running his hands over their flanks to check for injuries with the same care a mother might show a child. He never raised his voice in anger, though she could see frustration tighten his jaw when a fence post refused to set properly or a tool broke mid-task. He had a small collection of books that he read by firelight in the evenings, volumes of poetry alongside practical guides to animal husbandry and carpentry. Sometimes she would catch him staring out at the mountains with an expression of such profound loneliness that it made her chest ache. One afternoon, as they worked together to repair a section of fence damaged by winter storms, their hands brushed while reaching for the same nail. The contact lasted only a moment, but Silas pulled back as if burned, his face closing off. "Careful," he muttered, though whether he was warning her or himself remained unclear. Elara found herself wishing he wouldn't retreat so quickly, that he would let her close enough to understand the pain that drove him to this self-imposed exile. The evenings became her favorite time. After supper, which they ate at the rough-hewn table in comfortable silence, Silas would sometimes share stories of his past, carefully edited versions that revealed little of substance but gave her glimpses of the man beneath the armor. He had been a soldier once, she learned, fighting in conflicts he wouldn't name against enemies he couldn't forget. He had lost people, though he never specified who or how. He had come to these mountains 8 years ago seeking peace and found instead a different kind of war. The daily battle against isolation, memory, and the fear that he was too damaged to deserve happiness. "Why did you really take me in?" Elara asked one night as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of purple and gold. "The truth this time, not the noble version you gave the town." Silas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly he said, "Because I saw myself in you, not the outside, that's different. But the look in your eyes when that crowd gathered to watch you suffer, I know what it's like to be condemned for things you can't change, to be judged unworthy by people who don't know the first damn thing about who you really are. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. I also know what it's like to believe the lies they tell about you, to think maybe they're right, maybe you are worthless, maybe you deserve the exile. He turned his head to look at her directly. Nobody deserves that, and I figured if I could stop it from happening to one person, maybe that counts for something. The vulnerability in his admission cracked something open between them. Ilara felt the walls they'd both been maintaining begin to crumble. "You're not worthless," she said softly. "You're the first person who's ever treated me like I matter, like I'm more than just a burden to be tolerated or a joke to be laughed at." Silas's expression softened, and for the first time since they'd met, he smiled, a small, cautious thing, but genuine. "You do matter. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise." He stood then, breaking the moment before it could deepen into something more complicated. "Early morning tomorrow. We've got to start turning the garden soil if we want to plant on schedule." But as he moved toward the door, he paused and added, "Thank you, Ilara, for being here. It's good not to be alone." The words hung in the air long after he'd gone inside, and Ilara sat alone in the gathering darkness, feeling the careful architecture of her life shift and realign. She was falling in love with this difficult, damaged man, she realized, and the thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. The relative peace of their isolated existence shattered on a Tuesday morning when 3 riders appeared on the horizon. Silas spotted them first, his body going rigid as he stood in the garden with a shovel in his hands. "Get in the house," he said quietly, his voice carrying the edge of command that must have served him well in his soldier days. Ilara wanted to argue, to demand explanations, but something in his expression told her this was not the time for questions. She retreated to the cabin, watching through the window as Silas set down the shovel and walked slowly toward the approaching horses, his right hand resting casually near the pistol at his hip. The lead rider was a man in his 50s, well dressed by frontier standards, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Behind him rode 2 younger men, their hands also positioned near their weapons. They stopped 20 feet from where Silas stood, and even from the cabin, Ilara could see the tension crackling between the groups. The well-dressed man spoke first, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "Silas Thorne, it's been a long time." The familiarity in his tone suggested history, and none of it good. "Not long enough, Marshal Crenshaw," Silas replied, his voice flat and controlled. "Last I heard, you'd retired to some cushy position in Denver. What brings you back to the territories?" Crenshaw's smile was thin and cold. "Unfinished business, and an interesting report from the town of Redemption Creek about you taking in a young woman under questionable circumstances. Judge Harwick has some concerns about the arrangement, questions about impropriety, about whether the girl came willingly or under duress." His eyes flicked toward the cabin where Ilara stood watching. "I'm here to investigate and, if necessary, return Miss Walker to her father's custody." The words hit Ilara like a physical blow. Her father, who had thrown her out like refuse, now claimed concern for her welfare. The hypocrisy was staggering. She burst from the cabin before Silas could stop her, marching across the yard with fury, lending speed to her normally measured movements. "My father has no custody to speak of," she declared, her voice shaking with anger. he publicly abandoned me, told the whole town he couldn't afford to feed me anymore. Silas took me in when everyone else would have let me starve or worse. Crenshaw's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or recognition that this wouldn't be as simple as he'd hoped. That may be, Miss Walker, but the law requires that unmarried young women be under the guardianship of either family or a properly sanctioned institution. Your father has filed a petition claiming temporary insanity brought on by financial hardship. He says he regrets his actions and wants you returned home. Convenient timing, Silas said dryly. How much did it cost to file that petition? Or more importantly, who paid for it? His question hung pointed and sharp. Because we both know your father doesn't have money for lawyers, Alara. Someone's backing him, which means this isn't about you at all. It's about getting at me. Crenshaw's jaw tightened fractionally, confirmation enough that Silas had struck close to the truth. Your past associations don't concern me, Thorne. I'm here to enforce the law, nothing more. The girl returns to her father unless you can demonstrate legal guardianship. You have 3 days to produce such documentation, or she leaves with us. He gathered his reins, preparing to depart. And Thorne, if I find even a hint that you've harmed her or coerced her in any way, the past won't matter. I'll bring the full weight of the law down on your head. The 3 riders wheeled their horses and headed back toward the valley entrance, leaving behind a silence heavy with threat. Silas stood motionless, watching until they disappeared from view, then turned to Alara with eyes that held both apology and resignation. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have known this would happen. People like Crenshaw can't let go of grudges, and me taking you in gave them an excuse to come after me again. What did you do? Alara asked, though she suspected the answer might change everything. What's between you and the marshal? Silas walked slowly back toward the cabin, each step seeming to cost him effort. Inside, he poured 2 cups of coffee and sat heavily at the table, gesturing for Alara to join him. The story he told came slowly, pulled from him like teeth being extracted. During the war, his unit had been tasked with securing a supply route through hostile territory. Crenshaw, then a lieutenant, had ordered an attack on a civilian settlement suspected of harboring enemy sympathizers. Silas had refused to participate, convinced the intelligence was faulty. He'd been right. The settlement held only women, children, and elderly men. But the attack happened anyway, and when Silas reported the incident to superior officers, Crenshaw's political connections ensured the investigation went nowhere. Instead, Silas found himself dishonorably discharged on fabricated charges. He's been waiting years for a chance to finish destroying me, Silas said, staring into his coffee. And now I've given him that chance by bringing you here. If I can't prove legal guardianship, he'll take you back to your father. And knowing Crenshaw, he'll make sure your father understands the consequences of letting you go again. You'll be trapped there, used as leverage against me for whatever he's really after. The weight of the situation settled over Alara like a suffocating blanket. 3 days to find a solution to a problem with no apparent answer. What if we got married? The words escaped her mouth before she'd fully thought them through, but once spoken, she realized they made perfect sense. Legally married, then I'd be under your guardianship as your wife, not your ward. They couldn't force me to go back. Silas looked up sharply, his expression cycling through surprise, consideration, and finally something that looked like pain. "I can't let you do that. Marriage isn't something to be entered into as a legal strategy. You deserve better than a desperate arrangement with a man twice your age who's done nothing but bring trouble to your door." He shook his head firmly. "No, I'll find another way." But as the hours passed and Silas pored over his limited legal documents, the truth became increasingly clear. There was no other way. The territorial laws were explicit. Unmarried women under 21 required family guardianship unless formally emancipated through marriage or institutional placement. By the second day, with only 24 hours remaining, Silas's research had yielded nothing but frustration and dead ends. He sat at the table, his powerful shoulders slumped in defeat, looking more vulnerable than Alara had ever seen him. "Marry me," she said again, this time with complete conviction. "Not as a legal strategy, but because it's what I want. I'm not staying here out of gratitude, Silas. I'm staying because in 2 months of living beside you, I've seen the man you really are. You're kind and patient and honorable, even when you think no one's watching. You treat animals with gentleness and work with integrity and look at the mountains every evening like you're having a conversation with God." She moved closer, her heart hammering. "I don't need rescuing anymore. I need a partner, someone who sees me as an equal, not a charity case. And I hope, you might need the same thing." Silas's hands trembled slightly as he reached up to run them through his hair. "I'm not a good man, Alara. I've killed. I've made mistakes that haunt me every night. I'm old and broken, and I don't know how to be gentle all the time. What if I hurt you? What if the things I've done poison whatever good we might build here?" "Then we'll face it together," Alara said simply. "I'm not afraid of your past, Silas. I'm only afraid of losing the future we could have." She held out her hand, steady and certain. "Marry me, not to solve a legal problem, but because you're the rest of my life. Because waiting for you to believe you're worthy of happiness will take forever, and I'd rather start our life now than waste time on fear." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of decision and the ghost of possibility. Then, slowly, Silas reached out and took her hand in his. His calloused palm engulfed hers completely, warm and solid and real. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Because once we do this, there's no going back. You'll be tied to me and whatever enemies still want to see me destroyed." "I'm sure," Alara said, feeling the truth of it in her bones. "I've never been more sure of anything." The wedding took place at dawn the following morning in the small frontier chapel on the outskirts of Redemption Creek, presided over by Reverend Cotton, who had been roused from sleep by Silas's urgent knocking. The Reverend looked between them with undisguised skepticism. The mountain recluse and the cast-off daughter, an unlikely pair by any measure, but his faith compelled him to honor their request. They spoke their vows as the first light broke over the eastern plains, with only the Reverend and his sleepy-eyed wife as witnesses. Silas's hand shook as he slipped a simple silver band onto Alara's finger, a ring he revealed he'd carried for years, waiting for a future he'd convinced himself would never come. When Crenshaw arrived at the ranch at precisely noon with his 2 deputies and Alara's father in tow, he found a transformed situation. Silas met them at the property line, legal marriage certificate in hand, with Alara standing proudly beside him. The marshal's face darkened as he read the document. searching for any flaw or irregularity that might invalidate it. But Reverend Cotton's signature was unimpeachable, and the date stamp proved the marriage had been properly registered with the territorial clerk. "This is a sham," Elara's father sputtered, his face red with rage that had nothing to do with concern for his daughter. "She's been coerced. She wouldn't marry that man willingly." "I married him because I love him," Elara said clearly, her voice carrying across the space between them. "Because he's shown me more respect and kindness in 2 months than you did in 18 years. Because he sees value in me where you saw only burden." She stepped forward, her posture straight and confident. "You threw me away, Father. You don't get to decide what happens to me anymore." Crenshaw's expression suggested he'd tasted something bitter. He'd come expecting easy victory and found instead a legally unassailable situation. "This isn't over, Thorne," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only Silas could hear. "I know what you're doing. You're hiding behind that girl, using her to protect yourself. But eventually, she'll see what you really are, and when she does, I'll be waiting." "I'm not hiding," Silas replied with equal quietness. "I'm building something worth protecting, and if you come after it, you'd better bring more than old grudges and fabricated charges. Because I've got something now I didn't have before, a reason to fight back." The confrontation ended without violence, though the threat of it hung heavy in the air. Crenshaw and his party departed, and Elara's father left with them, his face twisted with impotent fury. Silas and Elara stood together watching them go, hands clasped, united against whatever storms might come. But the victory felt incomplete, shadowed by Crenshaw's parting words and the certainty that this battle was merely the first in a longer war. That night, they sat together on the porch as twilight settled over the valley. The mountains stood sentinel in the gathering dark, eternal and unmoved by human drama. "What happens now?" Elara asked, leaning her head against Silas's solid shoulder. "Now we live," Silas said simply. "We work the ranch, we build our life, and we don't let fear steal what we've fought to protect." He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. "And when they come again, because they will come again, we face them together." The months that followed were both beautiful and harrowing as Silas and Elara navigated the complex transition from reluctant companions to committed partners. Their marriage began as a legal necessity, but deepened into something genuine through the countless small intimacies of shared life. They learned each other's rhythms, discovered hidden depths in quiet moments, and built trust through consistent presence and honest vulnerability. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts, the garden yielding abundant vegetables, the chickens producing steadily, and the goats providing milk that Elara learned to turn into cheese. But the shadow of Crenshaw's threat never fully lifted. Reports filtered back through traveling merchants and the occasional visitor that the marshal had been asking questions in surrounding towns, building some kind of case against Silas. The nature of his investigation remained unclear, but its existence hung over them like a storm cloud perpetually on the horizon. Silas grew more vigilant, teaching Elara to shoot and ensuring they always had supplies laid in for unexpected trouble. He also grew more open, sharing stories from his past that painted a picture of a man who had tried to do right in impossible circumstances and paid dearly for his integrity. The true test came on a golden afternoon in September when Silas rode into the yard with a wagon containing 3 small children, 2 boys and a girl, none older than 7. Their clothes were ragged, their faces gaunt with hunger, and their eyes held the hollow look of those who had witnessed horrors beyond their years. "Wagon train disaster up in the northern pass," Silas explained as he helped them down. "Rock slide took out half the train. These 3 were the only survivors from their family. The territorial orphanage is overcrowded, and I couldn't just leave them there." He looked at Ilara with uncertainty, recognizing that he'd made a major decision without consulting her. "I thought maybe we could keep them here, at least temporarily." Ilara's response was immediate. She gathered the children close, murmuring reassurances as she led them inside to warm them by the fire and feed them properly. Over the following weeks, those 3 frightened waifs began to transform into something resembling children again. The older boy, Thomas, shadowed Silas everywhere, soaking up lessons in animal care and carpentry with desperate attention. The younger boy, Daniel, attached himself to Ilara, helping with cooking and garden work while slowly rediscovering his capacity for laughter. The girl, Sarah, remained quietest of all, often sitting for hours simply watching the mountains as if searching for something lost in their depths. The decision to formally adopt them came naturally, though it required another trip to town and more legal documentation that left them exposed to scrutiny. Crenshaw made his presence known at the territorial office, observing the proceedings with cold interest, but he raised no formal objection. Perhaps even he recognized that interfering with the adoption of orphan children would turn public opinion against him too decisively. Or perhaps more sinisterly, he was simply biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The ranch's population had doubled, transforming their quiet isolation into something more complex and vibrant. The cabin rang with children's voices, and the work multiplied exponentially, but so did the joy. Silas, whom Ilara had first known as a solitary mountain of a man, softened further under the influence of the children's unguarded affection. She would find him reading to them in the evenings, his deep voice gentle as he guided them through adventure stories. She would catch him teaching them to fish in the creek, his large hands patient as he showed small fingers how to bait a hook. The transformation was profound and beautiful, this man who had believed himself too damaged for family becoming the center of one. But Ilara also noticed the toll it took. Silas slept less, his nights interrupted by vigilance and old nightmares given new urgency by the presence of vulnerable children. His shoulders carried tension that never fully released, and his eyes constantly scanned the horizon for threats. One night, as they sat together after the children had gone to bed, he confessed his deepest fear. "What if I can't protect them? What if Crenshaw comes after them to get at me? They've already lost everything once. I couldn't bear to be the reason they lose everything again." "You won't be," Ilara said firmly, taking his hand in both of hers. "We won't be. Whatever comes, we face it as a family. That's what you've given these children, Silas. Not just shelter and food, but the knowledge that they belong somewhere, that someone chose them, wanted them, fought for them. That's worth more than any safety you could provide." The years passed with surprising swiftness after that, measured not in dramatic confrontations, but in the steady accumulation of ordinary moments. Thomas grew tall and strong, becoming Silas's right hand in running the ranch. Daniel discovered a gift for working with animals, especially horses, and began training them with quiet skill. Sarah emerged from her shell slowly, revealing artistic talent that manifested in sketches of mountain vistas and family scenes that decorated the cabin walls. They grew, they thrived, and they created a life together that was messy and difficult and more precious than gold. Crenshaw never launched his anticipated attack. Perhaps he found no weakness to exploit, or perhaps he simply aged into irrelevance, his vendetta losing energy as years passed without opportunity, or perhaps the sight of what Silas and Elara had built, a family forged from society's cast-offs, thriving against all reasonable expectation, made even a hard man recognize that some battles weren't worth fighting. Elara and Silas aged together on the frontier, their bodies showing the wear of hard labor and hard winters, but their spirits remained remarkably resilient. They never had biological children of their own, but the distinction ceased to matter. Thomas, Daniel, and Sarah were theirs in every way that counted, and eventually they grew up and built lives of their own while remaining close to the ranch that had saved them. When Silas finally passed away on a cold February morning, surrounded by family with Elara's hand in his last words were simple: worth it. All of it was worth it. Elara remained on the ranch after his death, content in the knowledge that the broken mountain man and the cast-off girl had built something lasting from the ruins of their separate pains. The mountains stood witness, unchanging and eternal, to the truth that love doesn't require perfection, only courage, patience, and the willingness to believe that everyone, no matter how damaged or dismissed, deserves a chance at home. On quiet evenings, Elara would sit on the porch they had shared, watching the sunset paint the peaks in familiar colors, and she would speak to him as if he sat beside her still. She would tell him about the grandchildren who visited, about Thomas's successful horse breeding program, about Daniel's gentle wisdom, about Sarah's paintings that now hung in galleries across the territory. She would tell him that he had been wrong about being too old, too broken, too dangerous for love, and she would thank him for taking a chance on the obese girl whom nobody wanted, who had somehow seen past his roughened exterior to the gentle heart beneath. Home is where healing begins. That truth, discovered in the mountains and proven through years of patient building, remained her constant companion through all the seasons that followed. And when her own time came to rest, she went peacefully, knowing that the love she and Silas had found improbable, inconvenient, and absolutely essential, had transformed not just their own lives, but rippled outward to touch everyone who had witnessed their journey from desperation to devotion.